A werewolf of the prophecy, stuck with a permanent curse of lycanthropy that he never wanted. A mute witch that cast spells with her hands and fingers, rather through incantations. A monstrous bear patrolling the forest with a quest of his own. And something of great evil controlling the very land they inhabit. Greetings and welcome. For those who have been following Victor's series so far, you may navigate to the finale. But just a heads up, it's the scariest ending I have written for any dark fantasy story on this channel so far. And for those who are new, you are in for a treat. Don't let my handmade parchment book, ink forming in real time, or even the flicker of candlelight shy you away. So this is Victor the Werewolf and the unknown land of monsters. I hope you enjoy. Victor was glad thunder had woken him up from his sleep rather than his nightmares. Storms come and go, but those nightmares, they never leave. The werewolf was seeking shelter in a wooden cabin beneath the forest ground. A cabin that didn't belong to him, rather to a man named Theseus. That name never meant much to Victor until a few nights ago. Theseus was the land's most skilled and knowledgeable hunter. He had been dealing with monsters since a teenager. However, as time passed, the concept of hunting monsters became an adrenaline kick for the man, instead of the principle behind it. Folks said he drove himself to madness. That line between monster and human became a blurry one. Theseus couldn't tell the difference anymore. His suspicions of human folk became so dire that he slaughtered and carved innocent people, accusing them of being monsters. Victor caught him in the act of murder just a few nights ago. Unfortunately, the victim didn't survive, but Victor made sure Theseus would never harm another human ever again. You see, Victor was a special class werewolf. Special class meant the strongest and fastest category of werewolves that ever existed. His grey fur, blue eyes, and towering humanoid presence was proof of it. To Victor, he only knew one other special class werewolf, a cursed man that needed no introduction, Ragnar Leifsson. However, as powerful as special class werewolves may be, the curse has a downside. They can never revert to their human selves ever again. Victor stared at the full moon many a times, hoping his curse would disappear when the morning sky took over. Alas, he was mistaken. Such was the burden of special class werewolves. They retained their memories, speech, and mannerisms, yet they could never walk freely on the human land ever again. Victor, however, was a bit more special. The written word had been made into a prophecy about him before he was even born. He had just completed the werewolf trials a few weeks ago and now wishes to return to the land that he once knew. Places like Redwater or the village of Harrow had been names he'd almost forgotten, for the werewolf was a long way from home. The hunter's cabin was small yet cozy, with minimal things inside to get by. Victor spent most of his time studying a stone tablet, an artifact that placed him in this unknown land. Perhaps understanding the markings would help him return home. However, his last candle had almost been depleted, and the cloak that he wore to disguise himself had been torn. Coin was needed. Victor then walked up the stairs leading him to a trapdoor. He opened the latch, climbed out into the forest, and felt the heavy rain soaking his fur. The werewolf adjusted his tattered hooded cloak, black in color, as he traveled the woodland ground, making his way towards a village. When he reached the back entrance of the village, he chose to remain in the shadows behind the tall trees. Victor then tugged on a rope and a bell rang once. Within a few minutes, an energetic village man came hustling through. His body language indicated a man who was about to partake in a shady deal. Then the villager spoke. "It's been a while since we've spoken, friend." Victor, looking at the ground to avoid the man from seeing his blue eyes, had said, "For the last time, I am not your friend." A rather cruel and harsh response, but Victor wasn't the man or the werewolf that he used to be. However, the village man was unbothered by Victor's coldness.
Say, Bud, village folk are becoming curious. They want to know about the man responsible for getting rid of monsters from the land. You can trust me. You don't need to hide in the shadows anymore,
Victor replied. Do you have any work for me?
Oh, yes indeed.
The villager flipped through a few pages of parchment and handed 3 sheets to Victor. The werewolf lifted his hand to grab it but then paused. He leaned to his right, shook his arm, and let the bagginess of the cloak cover his furry hand. Then he reached forward and grabbed the pages. Who are these people? He said. On those parchment sheets were sketches of 3 people done by village folk, 2 women and 1 man, Sherry, Mary Beth, and Cedric, respectively. Villagers had then hid behind walls, taking a peek and spying on the conversation. The village man, Timothy, chased them away, feeling embarrassed.
I'm really sorry about that, he said to Victor.
These sketches are folk from this village. They were abducted a few hours ago from this very forest, though none seemed too eager to retrieve them. And why is that?
Well, my people saw 2 vampires snatching them away.
You sure they were vampires? Asked Victor. Timothy responded like he was offended.
Are you kidding me? Vampires are like werewolves. We can spot them a mile away.
From a flash of lightning and a loud thundercrack, Victor's appearance was revealed for a brief moment, though not long enough for Timothy to see the monstrous werewolf in front of him. And so Timothy continued.
They were pale, the villagers said. Pale creatures, a man and a woman, moving so quickly they appeared as blurs. They grabbed Sherry, Mary Beth, and Cedric and then disappeared behind the fog before the storm arrived.
Victor folded the pages neatly and kept them in the cloak pocket. I'll look into it. Then Timothy's energetic demeanor changed to a troubled one.
Forgive me, friend, he said, and I don't mean to doubt you, but do you think you could take on 2 vampires all by your lonesome?
Timothy's concern was valid. Despite being a special class werewolf, vampires were still much quicker than Victor. The werewolf ignored the question and proposed one of his own, with just a single word. Payment.
Ah, yes, of course, Timothy said. Just the same like the last night. Let's see. Candles, ink, and parchment.
And a cloak, Victor added.
A cloak,
responded Timothy. I need a cloak large and loose enough to fit me. The water hag from last we spoke tore my current one.
Timothy's eyes lit up. Why, of course I could arrange that. I am a master tailor myself, that I am.
He looked at Victor and mumbled the measurements in his head.
Just give me a few minutes and it'll be done, he said.
As Victor turned around to walk away, the village man said, Still no luck in returning to your home, eh?
I told you, mister. I, nor anyone from around here, have ever heard or known of places called Redwater or the Harrow before.
Victor the werewolf was already a great distance away. He was deep in thought, snuffing the air, trying to catch a scent. Vampires may be undead creatures of the night, but they had a strange metallic blood-like smell to them. Victor's sense of smell was heightened, though he could only catch the scent from the earth from the pouring rain. He would normally take his time, plan his attack, but the werewolf had to be hasty with this hunt. He didn't want to make it known to Timothy and cause more panic to an already distraught village. Those vampires responsible for the abduction could have easily drained the blood of their victims right then and there in the forest. Vampires do not play with their food, and that detail troubled Victor. It wasn't the fact that he was hunting 2 vampires, rather the dilemma of going up against a hive of them. From the strange behavior of abduction done by the vampires told Victor one thing. They were taking their victims to a vampire nest. Though the storm continued, the rain had softened and the wind calmed itself, giving Victor a chance to fully catch the scent of not only the vampires, but the victims as well. The scent had taken him to a small house in the woods. The cottage looked modest, but the strobe light caused by lightning revealed peeling paint and broken gutters. This house had been abandoned for a very long time. Victor stood a great distance away. He knelt to the ground on one knee and touched the wet soil. There were tracks on the ground, a body being dragged with much force and aggression. The werewolf then rubbed his fingers together and brought them to his nose. A fragrance of rose and lavender mixed with a stinging metallic blood-like smell. When the werewolf approached closer, he heard the horrific sounds coming from inside the cottage. Biting, slurping, and a slippery swishing sound thumping against the windows. There was also a sound of a heartbeat fading away into the night. However, a cottage of that size would not be suitable for a vampire nest. Not only was it too small, but it was also too visible. Nevertheless, there were obviously vampires feeding on something or someone inside. Victor walked up to the door and calmly placed his ear against it, then knocked 3 times. His hand was so large and strong that it sounded like a hammer. Victor heard 2 vampires inside. The feeding noises abruptly stopped and they hissed in frustration. The male vampire angrily told the other to check who was at the door. His voice sounded coarse, evident that blood had been coating the insides of his throat. When the female vampire opened the door, she saw no one standing in front, just the breeze blowing through her long brown hair. Victor, however, could see her clearly. He was hiding in a tree in front of the cottage. One thing was certain, the villagers' descriptions were not exaggerations. These vampires were indeed pale. The female vampire had blood smeared on her face, but more plentiful around the mouth. Then she snuffed and caught Victor's scent, but it was too late. Victor leaped off the branch and dove towards the vampire woman. He tackled her to the ground and bit off a chunk of her neck. It all happened so quickly, and the vampire did manage to slice Victor's chest with her razor-sharp fingernails. However, to her surprise, the werewolf's wounds closed up almost instantly. Perks of being a special class werewolf. Victor wasted no time. He darted his hand towards the woman's chest, though not as a punch or a closed fist. His hand created a hole in the vampire's sternum, and then the werewolf ripped out her heart. The vampire man was kneeling on the ground, feeding on the victim. When he picked his head up, same like the vampire woman, his face smeared with blood. His fangs pushed out his mouth, and despite his long blood-soaked hair, his bat-like ears could not be concealed. He ran towards Victor, moving as a blur, just as the villagers had said. Then the vampire reached both his hands in front, fingernails growing like a switch had been flipped, ready to rip the werewolf apart. But those were not higher vampires. Yes, they were fast, but definitely not as quick as Fulian Hunt. The vampire thought his shadow had been playing tricks on him, when in reality it was Victor, moving with such speed and menacing fluidity. The werewolf crept up behind the vampire and snapped his neck before he turned. This wouldn't end him, but that was the plan. Victor needed one of them alive, so to speak. The werewolf had a moment to scan the room. The victim on the floor matched the third sketch Timothy had given him. The vampires were feeding on Cedric. He had lost too much of blood and clearly on his last breath. However, there was no blood near or around the victim's mouth, indicating there was no blood exchange or vampire turning. Victor put his head down. He wanted to save all 3 of them. Then he looked around the room and saw 2 more bodies piled in the corner. However, they were not part of the other 2 victims. Their bodies were decayed and possibly the owners of the cottage. Victor's eyes then moved to the wooden chair fallen over by the wooden table. It gave the werewolf an idea. The vampire man would wake up shortly, which meant whatever was brewing inside the werewolf's mind
had to be put into action immediately. 7 minutes and 47 seconds later, the vampire regained consciousness, but he wasn't standing. He was lying on the wooden table with the room light switched on directly over him. The brightness of the bulb stung his eyes, and when he tried to sit up or move, he couldn't. A wooden stake had been stuck in his arms respectively, right between the forearm and bicep, pinning him to the table. Victor had dismantled the wooden chair. Then the vampire hissed and growled at the werewolf. Without the cloak, Victor's true appearance was clear as day. He was well over 6 feet, his grey fur barely able to hide the muscle beneath. His blue eyes looked unnatural, sinister and glowing with ominous intention. Victor stood beside the table, arms folded, observing the vampire carefully.
I used to be a surgeon, you know, before this curse took over me at least.
Suddenly, when the vampire's senses returned fully, he started screaming frantically in pain. Victor placed his furry hand over the vampire's mouth and said,
"Shh. Do not disturb the forest. The animals are sleeping."
The werewolf, still with folded arms, paced around the table.
You vampires have an immensely high pain tolerance, and you can heal, though you are not immune to suffering.
Victor in this instance would be correct. The vampire on the wooden table had indeed recovered from the broken neck. However, that was only due to the blood it previously consumed. But now, being depleted from fresh blood, would the vampire be able to heal just as quickly as damage was being dealt to him?
Where are the other 2 victims?
The vampire hissed at the werewolf and spat at him.
Wrong answer,
Victor said, taking the sharpened wooden leg-turned stake and piercing the vampire's leg, further pinning him to the table. With the force Victor used, one would think his hand was a sledgehammer. The stake penetrated between the shin and upper foot. The vampire screamed with agonizing pain, trying to wriggle himself free.
I have carefully put the stake in. Your veins have been severed, ligaments have been ruptured, and your tendons are torn beyond repair. Where are the other 2 victims?
The vampire cursed at Victor but had been interrupted by another stake through the other leg at the exact same spot.
Next one goes through your heart,
Victor said. In agonizing pain, the vampire barely yelled out the information needed. The other 2 victims, Sherry and Mary Beth, were delivered to the nest. The nest was located at an old abandoned railway station, 16 minutes north of the cottage. These 2 vampires were basically peasants to the nest. The higher vampires used them for their dirty work, such as abducting victims from nearby villages. As their reward, the higher vampires allowed them to keep one victim to themselves to feed on. Victor asked,
Are the victims still alive?
Yes, the vampire blurted out in pain. He told Victor that if he removed the stakes, then he would gladly escort the werewolf to the nest. Victor, however, did not need to verbally refuse. The last stake through the vampire's heart was a clear response. Victor donned his black cloak, which had now barely been holding itself together. He glanced at Cedric with a painful look in his blue eyes. The werewolf would have to return to the cottage to fetch the body. It wasn't even a matter of payment or getting the job done, rather a form of respect for the family to perform the man's last rites. Then the werewolf exited the cottage and headed north. He didn't just move like a werewolf, more like a shadow navigating the forest at night. He had to be quick. It had been confirmed higher vampires occupied the nest, which meant the victims would not be alive much longer. That is, if the feeding hadn't already begun. Victor reached the abandoned railway station. He understood why the vampires chose that place as a nest. It wasn't difficult to find, but the darkness alone would deter anyone from exploring further. The werewolf took a deep breath in and exhaled slowly. Not only did he want to keep his heavy breathing to a lower volume,
He also wanted to quieten his heartbeat. The eerie silence coming from the bottom of the stairway was alarming. The fur running down Victor's spine had risen like spikes. The vampires below fed more silently than those in the cottage. With the intensity of the thunderstorm being at its all-time high, Victor walked down the stairway with only his blue eyes illuminating the darkness. The concrete steps had no railings on either side, just the walls. With every step closer, the horrific sounds became louder, slurping, gulping, and drinking that sounded more like chewing or suction through a straw. The werewolf got a hint of the rose and lavender scent from earlier, though faintly. The metallic, blood-like smell was too overbearing. When Victor reached the bottom, he peeked around the wall, glancing to his left. An ordinary human would just see tiny white eyes moving in the darkness, pupils that looked more like dots than natural eyes. The werewolf, however, could see clearly in the dark. The floor was covered in blood. The walls had blotches of blood smeared and spilled that looked ugly and messy. However, vampires did not find such a scene messy or disgusting. To them, it was their art gallery. Victor's claws involuntarily unsheathed themselves with how disgusting and obscene the place looked. The vampires were slouched over the ground, feeding on victims. Victor knew of a higher vampire back at home, though he looked nothing like what Victor was seeing. Their human selves were completely lost, so much so Victor wondered if they were even once human at some point. Their ears were much larger and pointy than the vampires in the cottage. All 5 of them were bald, with skin that looked more like plastic wrapped around their bones. Victor could still see their spines. These vampires were starving. When they took breaks from feeding, they would stretch their necks backwards. That's when Victor saw the purplish pulsating veins crawling on their faces, like tributaries on a map. He'd never seen anything like it in his past 8 months of being a werewolf. Those vampires did not look like they belonged to the land. Rather, they were resurrected. To Victor's right were Sherry and Mary Beth, identical to the sketches. Both of them sat against the wall with their eyes closed, right arm to their sides respectively. There was a bandage wrapped around their forearms with 2 spots of blood seeping through, puncture marks caused by the fangs. This told Victor the ancient vampires had indeed tasted their blood, but kept them aside to feed on later. The werewolf knew that trying to sneak them out of there would not only put him at a disadvantage from carrying them, but also put their lives in danger if and when the vampires attack. Victor removed his torn cloak and folded it neatly, keeping it on the last step. He loosened his neck, cracked his knuckles, and took another deep breath in. That had alerted the vampire creatures. They hissed and growled, crawling to their feet. Their white eyes now larger than before. Victor's eyes, however, were no longer a soft blue. They turned red like a contact lens had replaced his natural color. The wind whistled through the ground floor of the railway station. Only the sound of hisses and snorts, followed by a deep, low, ominous growl from Victor. And then the fight commenced. 3 vampires charged at Victor first. The werewolf front-kicked the middle one, sending the creature flying against the wall. The other 2 had already been beside Victor. They clawed at him with fingernails long and sharp, like thin daggers. He growled and moaned in pain, but he knew that a lot more damage was soon to follow. With his left hand, he twisted it around and took a swipe at the vampire adjacent to him. As for the one on the right, he grabbed the vampire not by the throat, by the top of its head, and pulled it off like it was a toy. The other 2 vampires had then pounced on Victor's back, maneuvering around the werewolf's body like spiders. Victor tried reaching for them, swinging his large arm backwards, missing with every try. The werewolf's neck and shoulders were being bitten and clawed. He felt those fangs puncturing his body, and the only thing that he could do for now was grunt and groan. Then Sherry and Mary Beth regained consciousness. They were startled, kicking their legs forward to further back themselves against the wall. They couldn't see Victor. In fact, they couldn't see anything. Just a pair of red eyes and 5 pairs of white eyes frantically moving in the darkness. Victor heard their petrified heartbeats and yelled at them to get out of there. His deep voice frightened them at first, but they had no choice but to listen to the stranger. Sherry and Mary Beth stumbled their way up the staircase. Behind them, they heard the echoing sounds of flesh being torn apart. Growls, hisses and roars, and a few bones being snapped and broken here and there. For 6 minutes they hid behind the tree at the top until they heard silence. Shortly after, a deep voice groans as it gets louder. Victor, in pain, slowly and uncomfortably put on his cloak. The village woman saw his red eyes change to blue and they were staggered. He stumbled towards them, dripping blood like a leaking geyser.
Sherry and Mary Beth, Timothy sent me.
Those were the only words he could mutter before showing them the sketches and missing posters of themselves. With rapid succession of lightning flashes, the woman's eyes traveled towards the stairway. Though only for a split second with each flash, they saw vampire creatures at the bottom of the stairway, dismembered in the most horrific way possible. Their eyes widened with fear, daring not to glance at the monstrous cloaked being in front of them. Victor said,
"You know your way back to the village."
Sherry and Mary Beth looked at each other, then gave a nod to Victor. The werewolf nudged his head to the side, gesturing for them to leave. Once they left, still feeling weak and drained, Victor took a few agonizing breaths, closed his eyes gradually, then slowly fell backwards, slamming his werewolf body to the ground. 1 hour and 15 minutes later, Victor was at the end of the woods standing behind a tree near the back entrance of the village. With Cedric's body over his left shoulder, Victor tugged on the rope and rang the village bell once. His eyes remained blue, his grey fur soaked with blood, and while his wounds had fully closed, he still felt the lingering pain of the damage done to him by the vampires. This time, Timothy wasn't as energetic as he was before. It would be sunrise soon, but that wasn't the reason for a demeanor change. With the baggy cloak covering Victor's hands, he gently placed Cedric's body in the arms of Timothy.
"Forgive me. I couldn't save him."
Timothy excused himself to deliver the body of Cedric to the now would-be grieving family. He returned with a large brown sack shortly after. "You have nothing to apologize for, friend," said Timothy. Victor saw how saddened the village man was, but his attitude was admirable. He knew it was bad, tragic, and heartbreaking even, but to him it could have been worse. There was always a positive thought to fall back to. For Timothy, there was always the light at the end of the tunnel. "Thanks to you, 2 of the best village nurses are returned home safely. And the fact that you would bring Cedric's body back reveals more about your character than you think." Victor didn't say anything for a while. "Thank you for that, I appreciate it, it means a lot," were sentences that couldn't seem to come out. Timothy filled the silence by saying, "I have your stuff in the bag. I know with absolute certainty the cloak will fit, but you're welcome to bring it back for alterations." Victor picked up the sack, tossed it over his shoulder, and said thanks. The rain was gradually lessening in its intensity, and the thunder, while still present, wasn't as loud as before. As Victor turned around to walk away, Timothy said, "So, you're a werewolf then?" Victor stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened, but he dared not look back at Timothy. Another long pause. "Sherry and Mary Beth told me. They've seen werewolves before, but none like you," they said. "They told me what you did to those vampires." Victor put his head down, his blue eyes looking at his furry feet. He felt ashamed, embarrassed by what he had become. Timothy continued, "They told me how you saved them from those monsters. If it wasn't for you, they wouldn't be alive.
Just as Victor was about to walk away, the village man in his medieval tunic-like attire had said, "If you think that makes me or the village folk think of you differently, then you would be mistaken. I do not know what happened to you or where you came from, but folk around here are different. We do not judge based on appearance, we judge by actions. You have prevented drownings by getting rid of the water hag a few nights ago, and now you got rid of the vampires. If anything, we owe you our lives." Victor took a moment to comprehend those words. How long has it been since he heard something like that? "If your current lodgings do not serve you well, you always have a home in this village. And that's not just coming from me, but the villagers as well." Victor, still looking at his feet, said,
"Thank you, friend."
Timothy said, "When you are ready to reveal yourself to me, I trust that you will. But until then, may I at least know your name, friend?" The werewolf looked over his shoulder and then just a little bit more.
"Victor. My name's Victor."
Then the werewolf walked away into the remaining hours of the night, making his way to the hunter's cabin, ready to spend even more restless nights deciphering the stone tablet. Sherry and Mary Beth, now with tended wounds and fresh and clean bandages, stood by either side of Timothy. They spoke in a soft voice simultaneously and asked, "So who is he then?" Timothy, with a warm, comforting smile on his face, had answered, "That's Victor. Victor the werewolf." Yet another night, Victor found himself traveling in the forest. It had been a few nights since he fought the ancient vampires in the abandoned railway station. But tonight, the special class werewolf wasn't hunting anything, rather looking for something specific. After his futile attempts at analyzing the stone tablet, he did find something worth looking into. The engravings revealed an ingredient most peculiar: cypress root. Victor knew that he would find those in abundance in the swamp. It had been a few minutes past 10 p.m. The forest was dark and gloomy, with thick fog almost swallowing the werewolf. His blue eyes like magical lanterns, able to see in the dark with ease. He never needed to worry about his identity being revealed anymore. The cloak Timothy had crafted for him was quality of the best kind. What he did worry about, though, was getting lost. Victor was in an unknown land, and not being able to find his way had frightened him more than fighting monsters. Throughout his travel, he would claw the bark of the trees as his own waypoints. But how did the werewolf know where to travel to? Victor's sense of smell, especially as a special class werewolf, was heightened. His nose picked up a scent about 2 miles back. A foul smell that had a mixture of dampened earth and a musky aroma from anoxic soil. Not forgetting the unpleasant, rotting, stinging smells that overpowered the rest. That was decaying vegetation, stagnant, ugly water, and gases released from microbial activity. When in doubt, Victor always trusted his nose. Not before long, the werewolf reached the swamp. The cypress trees were old and tall, at least 55 feet. The water was murky and black, carrying the moss from the trees. If boats traveled through that swamp, they would most certainly get stuck. That surface barely looked like normal water, more like dark oil or black sludge, unable to cause any ripples. It wasn't the smell that distracted Victor so, rather a sound. He heard water dripping from something, but where? That night it hadn't rained. Droplets falling rapidly, drop, drop, drop onto the dampened ground. Victor retrieved the cypress root and kept it in his cloak pocket. He thought the sound would stop, but it only got worse. And now the werewolf felt a sense of déjà vu, noises that still torment him, sounds that remind him of the day he was turned into a werewolf. Victor heard rope tightening and creaking. An object,
something heavy, swayed against the wind. Whenever it did, the leaking, dripping noise became louder. The fur on Victor's spine rose as he investigated, and to his horrific surprise, he found the source. His head traveled upwards first, slowly, gradually with reluctance, then his eyes followed. Up and up it moved, until Victor saw the man above, suspended by a rope on the cypress tree. A man that had more lacerations on his body than one could count. That dripping noise was not water, it was blood. The werewolf didn't catch its scent. Human blood mixed with the smell of the swamp was impossible to pinpoint with such precision. Victor looked at the body as the tormenting flashbacks haunted his mind. He looked around him, studying the swamp carefully, trying to find the one responsible for such a nightmarish deed. Alas, he saw nothing. However, the werewolf didn't know that for the next 2 nights, his agenda would change. For a human-turned-monster, much like himself, had committed such a crime, drawing blood from its victims. A creature known as the Rougarou. With an hour left for sunrise, the village guards had lowered the body from the swamp. Victor, with his black hooded cloak, stood a respectful distance away. No doubt those guards were suspicious of him, but he wasn't alone. Next to him was a village man going by the name Timothy. Timothy was 40 years of age, though none could ever tell. The man looked no older than 20. He was always jovial, laughing, smiling, and extremely kind, to the point of being a movie character. Timothy wore a white long-sleeve top with an old brown cloak-like robe over. He had brown hair that touched the lower portions of his ears, curly like broccoli. Timothy held an oil lantern in his hand, which didn't seem to help much from how dense the fog was. However, despite an outstretched arm, his hand was surprisingly still, too steady in fact. Victor looked at Timothy and asked, "Have you ever seen something like this before?" Timothy took a long while to answer and said, No, I have not." He was afraid. Even if his voice showed a hint of fear, his expression did too. Victor placed his large werewolf hand on Timothy's shoulder and said, "Maybe one of the journals in the hunter's cabin has something useful."
"But it would take us hours to find something. We have nothing to go on."
"Oh, I think we have a lot to go on, my friend."
"How so?"
"I saw the victim's body. Those lacerations were not random. They were carefully inflicted at positions and locations of the body to draw blood faster and more easily. Severed arteries, sliced veins, whatever did this wanted to bleed out their victim. With that being said, we can rule out vampires along with werewolves, wolves, or any other wild animal for that matter. They wouldn't care if their prey was drained of their blood first. More so, whatever did this didn't devour the victim. Awfully specific and peculiar. I think that's enough to go on, wouldn't you?" Timothy was impressed. At times, he would forget Victor wasn't just a werewolf, but a surgeon before that as well. So they made their way back into the woods, traveling towards the hunter's cabin. "I'm impressed. You seem to know your way around the Lance Forest like it's your home."
Thank you, friend. I've actually lived in the Sherwood Forest, you know. Back in the day at least. My friends and I built log cabins in this place. Folk called us the Merry Men.
Timothy was so excited telling Victor that last but abruptly stopped, as if revealing too much. His demeanor changed and so did his voice, but that was the past. The next thing Timothy knew, he was flat on his back on the cold forest floor. A group of unruly village travelers had bumped into him. Victor walked toward Timothy first, helping him to his feet, then picked up the lantern that rolled away. Victor was about to have a word with the troublemaker, but stopped dead in his tracks. A member of his own group had grabbed the man by the scruff of his neck, pulled him closer and whispered in his ear.
Victor assumed they knew about his werewolf identity, but that wasn't the reason for their panic. Despite the urgent whispering, the werewolf heard it loud and clear. "You fool! Don't you know who you bumped into? Show your respect and apologize to the man right now, unless you want an arrow between your eyes." The troublemaker turned around and looked at Timothy properly. His eyes widened with fear and shame, then said, "Forgive me, Robert, I wasn't thinking." Timothy replied, "Nothing to forgive, my friend. You be well on your way and safe travels on your journey, eh?" As the group of village travelers walked away in the opposite direction, Victor observed Timothy with an apprehensive look.
"Why did he call you Robert?"
"Oh, that is my first name, one that I no longer go by. It's a time in my life that I wish to forget. Anyway, let's make haste, friend. We cannot afford any more wasted time."
An hour or two had passed when Victor and Timothy sat near the hunter's cabin. It was early morning but still dark and gloomy with fog smothering the trees. Timothy had a pot of coffee brewing over the small campfire, while Victor and he sifted through journal upon journal, trying to find something. Alas, Timothy said,
I think I found something. Here, have a look-see."
He handed Victor the open journal before taking it back to read from it. "A Rougarou," Victor said.
"Well, I think so. This was the only thing that I could find regarding the withdrawal of blood."
"What does it say?"
Victor then poured both him and Timothy a cup of coffee.
"The curse of the Rougarou begins in either of these two ways. The first and oldest way is called the lentil rule. If a man or woman has broken the rules of Lent, a 40-day fast or penance before Easter for 7 years in a row, they could transform into the beast. The second method is a much quicker transformation called the witch's hex. A witch may specifically curse a person, either through voodoo or sometimes known as hoodoo, if they were badly behaved or greedy. However, there are also two methods that follow for the curse to pass on. Folk called it the hypnotic gaze. The eyes of the Rougarou, a chimera-like beast, is said to be the window of its tortured soul. Looking in its eyes will not only frighten you, but also capture your soul, marking you to be the next beast. Another way for the curse to be cured but also passed down is from drawing blood. If the Rougarou draws blood from its victim, not necessarily to kill them, then the marking of the beast is carried in their blood like a parasite and its new host. But the curse doesn't end there. It's said to last 101 days, provided in that time the person turned monster does not talk about their transformation. Once the curse is passed on to a new host, the original host would have to further remain silent for exactly a year and a day, or else the curse finds the original or previous host, repeating the 101-day Rougarou transformation. Having chimera traits might sound like the best bet to track the beast.
What does that mean?
Chimera is when a person's cells or tissues have two sets of DNA. In this case, half man, half animal, beast or monster. Does it say what the creature looks like?
Nope, only that the transformation subsides after sunrise. The man or woman turned monster will have symptoms of sickness during the day. It's mainly a creature of the night and moon, much like
myself, you can say it. I do not take offense. What weaknesses does the beast have?
Who knows? There's nothing else written in the journal entry. Just a rough ink sketch of coins with the number 13 written in blood.
That's odd. I wonder what the number 13 could symbolize.
Well, 13 is considered unlucky. 13 also deviates from normality. 12 months in a year, 12 hours on a clock, 12 apostles. 13 is irregular.
Victor pondered for a moment, then said, "We cannot be looking for a half-man, half-creature in broad daylight. If the cursed transformation reverts at sunrise, we know the Rougarou's host doesn't live far from the bayou. If we can visit folk who live near that swamp, see who's showing signs of sickness, we can stop the beast from transforming. as well as find out who has made contact with it within the past 101 days.
That's easier than it sounds, friend. Folk who live near the creek always show symptoms. Coughs, sneezes, snuffles, stomach aches. It's nearly impossible when the swamp is so toxic.
Then we do it the other way. Speak to the folk near the swamp. Tell them about Lent as well as the mention of the Rougarou. I'll stand nearby observing those people carefully. If I see an eye twitch of fear, or if I hear a change of pace in their heartbeat, then we can narrow it down.
Victor, what if we cannot find the host? What if the beast comes out at night yet again, drawing blood from its victims in the swamp?
Then we do it my way. I shall be waiting for the Rougarou. Victor and Timothy reached the town of Lashlan, a small town that felt more peculiar than it looked. Houses were built with stone and steep gables, thatched with dry river seeds to accommodate for rainfall and humidity. There was no foundation per se, rather stilts in the dampened ground covered in moss carrying the small buildings. There were wooden and sometimes stone bridges that formed narrow pathways between houses. When Victor and Timothy walked on the swaying bridges, they looked like two drunken men trying to balance themselves. The folk of Lashlan, however, had no problem. Their center of gravity or equilibrium had been adjusted from a very young age. Timothy was distracted by a group of kids trying out their bows and arrows near the dampened land not too far away. The village man's eyes lit up with joy like a proud father, though he noticed one of the kids kept missing their target, so he pardoned himself from Victor for a quick detour to offer his advice. "Greetings, young man," Timothy said. "Do forgive me for the interruption, but it seems there is something wrong with your bow. May I have a look?" The boy willingly gave Timothy his bow to examine. "Ah, see right here. The wood carving hasn't been crafted properly. You will never hit your target because of the imbalance of the weight when the string is drawn." The boy in an innocent voice said, "The bigger kids gave this to me and said this was the best bow." "Well, that is certainly a cruel trick played upon you, young man. I tell you what, why don't I purchase the bow from you and you get yourself another, better one, eh?" So the kid accepted. Timothy bought the bow and arrows for a gold coin. The boy's eyes lit up as he ran to his mother to show her. It was custom in Lashlan for a stranger not to leave empty-handed, especially after spending so much coin. So the boy's mother gave Timothy all the coin she could find, 15 pennies to be exact. Victor and Timothy then split up. The werewolf walked towards the left, hoping the locals would provide him with the information regarding the Rougarou, while Timothy ventured right, just a few meters away from the archery practice towards a fishing shop. The locals passed remarks on Victor's cloak, mentioning it was too humid to be wearing such a garment. Others spoke on his unnatural size, and some said his voice was too deep, like a frog stuck in his throat. Nevertheless, they provided him with some really intriguing gossip. The locals said they know about the victims in the swamp. They warned folk so many a times not to venture there, but travelers and strangers ignore signs like they cannot read. The Rougarou was a beast that haunted the land for more than 2 years now, leaving lacerations on victims, kept them undevoured, and bled them out before they were found. At night, especially when the swamp is at its darkest, folk lock their doors, windows are boarded up, and cotton wool is placed into the ears of both younger and older people. When Victor asked them why the cotton wool, they said the Rougarou calls them by their names. He summons them to the swamp, not through a mumble or a growl, rather in a wet voice that ends up mimicking their own or of their loved ones. It also leaves signs in the swamp, broken branches, lost items, valuables, and so forth, luring victims deeper into its home. The locals say they saw the creature throughout the 2-year span. It isn't a werewolf. They thought it was, but upon closer inspection, they saw they were wrong. The beast is more of a half-man, half-wolf dog-like being, with patches of black fur that looked matted and wet, glowing red eyes, sharp teeth with visible canines. They described the creature to be just as large as Victor, if not taller, though less bulkier. But the most bizarre thing Victor heard was the Rougarou wears brown trousers. Trousers that stretch during the transformation, as they've seen no tears or holes in it. So far from everything they've told the werewolf, it slowly began checking out with the journal entries by the hunters. The locals even spoke about the chimera feature, but there was still a loose end that didn't seem to tie up. The special class werewolf knew that stories like those, especially encounters with unknown or unfamiliar creatures, became exaggerated to make themselves look more important. However, the next part really stuck in Victor's mind. They said there have been a few who had an encounter with the Rougarou, not through a window or from afar, but in the swamp itself, and lived to tell the tale. While not a weakness, these folk found a way to escape the monster. For some strange reason, the Rougarou didn't maintain eye contact with them. In fact, that's how they escaped. Whenever they forcibly looked at or tried to look at the beast's eyes, it would grunt like it was irritated and either close its eyes or cover them. This only worked a few times. There have been some who tried to do the same, though the Rougarou was too quick for them, snatching them away. One thing was certain, the locals concluded. The beast, as they know, is at its strongest it's ever been. As many times as guards tried to fight it, none have lived to tell the tale. They told Victor that if he wanted more information, then he should talk to Remy at the fishing shop. He makes sure the townfolk never break the rules of Lent, and if they do, he also makes sure they keep their fast, at least in the 7th year. Victor, the special class werewolf, then joined Timothy at the fishing shop. There they met a shopkeeper going by the name Remy, a rather pleasant gentleman with long hair, a long beard, and brown trousers. He told Timothy everything about the Rougarou, the sightings, appearance, the curse itself, and how the beast operated. When Remy offered a handshake to Victor, the werewolf refused, not only to keep his furry hand a secret, but also to notice the marks he saw. When they left the fishing shop, Timothy said, "Well, at least we can rule him out. Such a nice gentleman. If he was the Rougarou, he wouldn't be blatantly blurting out its information and encounters. Remember what the book said. Those who speak of the curse will constantly be returned to the monster state for 101 days each time." It's him.
What? Did you hear what I just...
Did you see his hands?
What about them?
They have markings of rope embedded into his palms. Folk often mistake the effects of a curse. They think if the monster turns back into a human, all signs or wounds would be lost. If I had to become a human again, my body will be covered in more battle scars than one could count. The beast may heal the wounds, but the human always carries the mark. There isn't a single local in this area with those marks. Furthermore, we're looking at the curse the wrong way.
But the book said...
I understand what the book said, but I trust the locals more. We've entered this mystery the wrong way, assuming it's a tragic curse. But what if it isn't? Locals talked about a Rougarou haunting the swamp for more than 2 years straight. Not a single description differed among them. If the curse lasted for 101 days, provided silence is kept in effect for a year and a day after, wouldn't the beast's description change? This Rougarou wore the same trousers for 2 years. We are not dealing with a tragic man unable to run away from the curse. We are dealing with a man who doesn't want the curse to leave him. That's why he avoids eye contact. That's why he's bleeding his victims to death. He doesn't want the curse to transfer to anybody else, and it won't as long as they aren't alive. The locals said the beasts know their names, their habits, their prized possessions. Who better to know that than a local himself?
Timothy gave a deep sigh. He understood what Victor said and it bloody well made sense, but it was also a massive reach. However, there was a way to test out the werewolf's theory. Victor told Timothy to tell Remy that a travel party will be passing through the swamp tonight. Strangers that would be crossing the west end, the opposite side of where the body was found last night. If the Rougarou appears at the west end rather than its usual east side, then it's Remy. However, if the Rougarou is seen at the east side, then Victor would gladly admit that he was wrong and track down the Rougarou, finding the man responsible for the heinous crimes. And so, the night begins. Victor was at the west end of the swamp, the side where the made-up travelers supposed to wander that night, while Timothy, with a dysfunctional bow and a quiver of poorly crafted arrows, was at the east end. For his sake, Victor hoped the Rougarou showed up at his own side. Timothy didn't seem able to defend himself, especially with a broken bow. That night, the clouds burst with rain. Thunder rattled the sky and the fog below hovered like an unwanted visitor. The werewolf barely saw Timothy waving at him from the other end. Victor crouched down towards the vegetation, examining tracks once again while he waited. Maybe he would find something that he missed before. However, Victor was unaware the Rougarou was behind him, approaching in the shallow water. The rain drowned out its footsteps. The thunder swallowed its beating heart. But even if the weather that night never permitted, the werewolf and villager Timothy was in the beast's habitat. Victor's ears moved like a fly was stuck on it. An arrow whistled past him, almost curving with the wind and carried with the rain. The werewolf turned around to see the arrow pierce the Rougarou's shoulder, fired by Timothy a great distance away. There was no time to think, it was Remy. Victor entered the dark, murky water, unable to move at his full speed. The Rougarou, as the townsfolk said, wore brown trousers. It had black patches of fur like the creature suffered with mange. The body was indeed humanoid, but the head looked like a wolf merged with a dog. The beast was slender, its arms long, and it was much taller than Victor. The Rougarou's red eyes smoldered like molten lava, piercing through the fog. It didn't struggle the way Victor did. The Rougarou moved just fine. The werewolf and the swamp beast charged at each other. The monster sliced Victor's shoulder and leg with its sharp claws, but now that meant Remy would have to kill the werewolf to prevent him from becoming a Rougarou. Victor knew that. He used that against Remy. With his special class nature, every wound began healing, which frustrated the creature. In the corner of his eye, Victor saw Timothy running with haste through the fog, making his way to the battle. He yelled at Victor, requesting the werewolf doesn't kill Remy. Victor and the Rougarou tussled for a short while. The werewolf bit Remy's neck, elbowed his temple, kneed his stomach, and then picked the Rougarou up and body slammed him in the water. A half-man, half-beast was no match for a special class werewolf. At this point, Victor was just toying with him. But then the tide changed. When Timothy reached the west end, the creature smiled as its long tongue licked the sides of its mouth. Victor's blue eyes widened with the realization of what the Rougarou was doing. It was going for Timothy. The swamp worked to Victor's disadvantage. The faster he had to move his heavy legs, the slower he had to drag it. Then the Rougarou leapt out of the water, taking a swipe at Timothy. Luckily, the village man dodged, though barely, but stumbled and rolled away. Just as Victor made it out, he was about to take a swipe at the Rougarou, then abruptly stopped. Timothy, on his back, getting to his feet, was also stumped by what they witnessed. The 15 pennies given to Timothy by the woman in Lushlan had fell out of his pocket during the escape. It lied in front of the Rougarou as the creature knelt down on the dampened ground, licking its lips and frantically counting the coins.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
And the creature's frustration grew. It restarted the count, 1 through 12 and no further. Victor and Timothy saw the monster's brain working through its eyes and the movement of its fingers. Since its existence was tied to the old cycle, the 12 hours of night, the number 13, which represents the start of a new unknown cycle or the unlucky margin, is literally beyond its supernatural comprehension. The Rougarou simply cannot see or process a 13th object. However, it also had to do with the compulsive nature of the curse. The curse of the Rougarou isn't just physical, it's a mental fog. When a human transforms, they lose their higher reasoning, but keep a vestige of human curiosity. So the Rougarou is hit with a form of supernatural arithmomania, a compulsive need to count. When it reaches 12 and sees there's still more, but cannot find the word or concept for 13, then it assumes it made a mistake. It doesn't just stop, it restarts. It becomes trapped in a logical loop, desperately trying to solve the puzzle for the 13th coin, right until the sun rises and the light of day breaks the trance.
So now what?
Victor asks. Timothy says, well, I guess we wait for sunlight when the curse falls away. Then we could ask him how he became the monster. After a long, boring, grueling wait, daybreak arrived. Suddenly, the Rougarou snapped out of the trance and began panicking. Remy's body began aching as he roared and howled, reverting to a human again, trying to get away. But Victor wrapped his furry hand around the man's leg. After restraining him, Victor and Timothy found out Remy became the Rougarou due to breaking the rules of Lent. It's not that it was a mistake or that he didn't know. He felt his actions would anger the churchfolk in his town. When he realized on how the curse worked, he used it against them, harnessing its power. Rather than falling victim to a tragic transformation, he became the monster of the swamp. In his deluded mind, the massacre in the swamp was to send a message for those who cursed him. This was his way of changing the rules to have a double-edged sword. If he was cursed for breaking the rules of Lent for 7 years in a row, then he wanted to eradicate folk that actually observed the rules of Lent, making it seem like keeping the fast was what got them killed. Timothy heard the guards approaching and told Victor to leave at once. The werewolf didn't have his cloak with him. Before doing so, Remy on his knees told the duo, "You'll have to kill me to break the curse. I'll never stop. I'll never let it leave me. I will talk about it for—" But Victor crushed Remy's jaw and rubbed out his tongue.
"I would gut you like a fish and throw you into the water, but my friend wishes to spare your life. Now you cannot tell a single soul about what happened. During the 101 days, the curse will rot alongside you in a cell."
Timothy asked, "But what if he purposefully transfers the curse to someone else while he's locked up?"
"He won't. Tell the guards to leave 13 coins outside his cell every night."
The Rougarou had caused enough terror in the swamp near Lushlan, but Timothy was smart in sparing the man. Those who have lost loved ones in the swamp should see the man responsible for doing so. If Victor killed a monster, not only will all eyes be on the werewolf next, but folk wouldn't fully receive closure. A few hours later, Victor was back in the hunter's cabin. He felt tired and his body ached, but he kept the cypress root on the table. It had been a grueling week so far, trying to get answers from the tablet, but maybe this root served as an ingredient to a portal back home. Nevertheless, Victor crawled into bed and let out a deep sigh. As exhausted as he was, he couldn't sleep. So he picked a few of the hunter's journals and stumbled upon something rather interesting. Something about Timothy. He read up about an entry titled The Merryman, and the name Robert appeared again. When the werewolf finished reading the entry, he dropped the journal in sheer disbelief. Everything, since he met Timothy, had played back in his mind. The last page of the entry read, "Beware of the outlaw in the Sherwood Forest, leading the Merryman." Timothy bought the bow and arrows for a gold coin. However, despite an outstretched arm, his hand was surprisingly still, too steady in fact. "Ah, thank you, friend. I've actually lived in the Sherwood Forest, you know, back in the day at least. My friends and I built log cabins in this place. Folk called us the Merrymen." "Show your respect and apologize to the man right now, unless you want an arrow between your eyes."
Why did he call you Robert?
"Oh, that is my first name, one that I no longer go by. It's a time in my life that I wish to forget. You will never hit your target because of the imbalance of the weight when the string is drawn."
While Timothy, with a dysfunctional bow and a quiver of poorly crafted arrows, an arrow whistled past him, almost curving with the wind and carried with the rain. The werewolf turned around to see the arrow pierce the Rougarou shoulder, fired by Timothy a great distance away. Robert Timothy Fitzooth, alias Robin Hood. The hunters were right behind her. Their footsteps quicken. They hurl curses at the witch, along with their rocks, arrows, and daggers. The leather straps of their quivers and the friction of their jerkins against their sides had created a rhythmic, dry grating sound in the dark, musty forest that evening. But the witch wasn't at her full strength. Her long black hair was covered in dirt and dry leaves. She wore faded black velvet attire with cross-lacing of twine over a plunging neckline. Her tattered long sleeves and the deep gashes on her legs and arms, now turning her skin pale and veins dark, were all signs of the struggle she endured for the past hour. Behind the group of hunters were even more men, but they never charged forward. They were on the ground breathing their last breaths, for the branches from the tree stuck into them like needles in a voodoo doll. She was at the end of her tether, fatigued with betrayal, exhausted from running, and in what seemed to be the moments leading up to her demise, she casted another spell, a desperate attempt despite the lack of energy and power. The hunters did not hear the incantation. They don't hear a single word leave the witch's mouth. With her lips folded inwards, pressing down on each other from the pain she felt, she stiffened her finger joints on both hands and held them closely together, barely enough to not touch. The witch began moving her fingers, like spiders' legs crawling around an invisible crystal ball, and the branches of the trees beckoned her call, subjecting themselves to her womb of manipulation. Some of them bent like twine wrapping around the hunters' necks. Most were used as projectile weapons, and the larger tree logs were like rocks tumbling over during a landslide. An impressive effort indeed, but not enough to get rid of all of them. The last thing the witch saw was the back end of a hunter's bow spear, knocking her out for the evening. These hunters would soon take her to the stake for her trial, and if the Inquisition did not like what they saw or heard, they would burn the witch at the stake without a moment's hesitation or remorse. However, they would have to hurry to do so, for Victor the werewolf was not too far behind. With the life led by Victor thus far, you would assume he saw it all. He was a werewolf that could talk and retain all his memories, but could never revert to a human ever again.
He had a friend back home who was a vampire, working at the Redwater police station as one of the best detectives out there. He knew of a goblin servant from hell that came down to Earth to help in the battle against the dark forces, while fighting a hellhound so large and strong that it could destroy the forest without even breaking a sweat. He knew demons and monsters were not just spooky stories around a campfire. They lived and walked among humans, controlling the world and the future of it as he knew of. But never, even in his craziest dreams, would he have expected the 40-year-old man, Robert Timothy Fitzooth, a kind and simpleton villager helping him in this unknown land, to be the legendary Robin Hood. The fog in the forest was so dense that only the werewolf silhouette and lantern were visible. Victor didn't need a lantern. His blue eyes with a faint glow to them could see in the dark like his very own night vision. But carrying a lantern while donning his hooded black robe-like cloak made him fit in. The village bell rang 3 times and the werewolf knew his friend needed to see him. Timothy, barely visible in the fog, waved at Victor enthusiastically as if wanting to break exciting news to him. Victor reached the bell and placed the lantern on the ground. He folded his arms and looked at Timothy dead in the eye without saying anything. Timothy said, "Oh, you seem upset, friend. Something the matter?"
See, friend, a few nights ago when we encountered the Rougarou beast in the swamp, you fired an arrow in the night storm that was carried in the wind and struck the monster's shoulder. It baffled me even in the heat of battle on how a simpleton could fire such a shot with a dysfunctional bow and a poorly crafted arrow.
Timothy never said anything, but he looked worried. Despite the cold breeze, his hands became sweaty and he loosened his clothing to give room for his skin to breathe. Victor continued,
The only archer who I knew back in my land that was even capable of such a feat was an elf. But then I read pieces of manuscripts in the hunter's cabin, compiled stories of an outlaw, Robert Timothy Fitzooth, the man who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, who was so skilled with a bow that it made him look like a wizard. A man known to the people as Robin Hood.
Timothy hung his head in shame, scratching his brown curly hair. So I guess those stories still exist, hey? I did not mean to hide it from you, friend. My life as an outlaw should remain in the past. My secret is meant to protect the people closest to me.
I can understand that, Timothy. And I guess you owe me no explanation. I see this matter makes you uncomfortable, so tread on the matter I will not.
I appreciate that, friend. Now onto something important. Forgive me for calling you at this hour of night, though a friend of mine, Alan Adale, mentioned hearing something that might interest you. He performs his ballads outside taverns, inns, and sometimes even the Great Hall. He says there is an old man asking around for a werewolf. Victor frowned and adjusted his posture, listening to what Robin Hood told him. Folk thought this old gentleman was crazy because as it stood before you arrived, werewolves, at least the kind that you are, only existed in stories. He says that he knows about the land you speak of, the town of Redwater, the village of Harrow, and of a night-flying woman with green eyes and black velvet clothing that also wishes to return to such a land.
Night-flying woman?
Oh yeah, sorry, that's what we refer to as a witch. He said he lives in the brick cottage 273 southwest of here at the village in the valley. If a grey werewolf with blue eyes wishes to meet him, you needn't worry about frightening him. This elderly man is blind. Victor was tense. This could very much be a trap. Whatever the old man was inquiring about sounded too good to be true. It was too specific. How did he know of Victor, let alone he had grey fur or blue eyes? How did he know of Redwater or the Harrow? Nevertheless, the werewolf had no other leads to go on, besides fetching cypress roots from the swamp a few nights ago. Meeting this elderly man wouldn't hurt, and if it was indeed a trap, it should not be any issue for the werewolf. Before departing, Robin Hood told the werewolf to be careful. The village in the valley was awfully close to hunter headquarters, and those hunters were not people to take lightly. He told Victor to be discreet and use stealth like his life depended on it. The outlaw archer would join him shortly after tending to some errands in the village. The werewolf, disguised in his cloak holding an oil lantern in hand, set out for the night, making his way to cottage number 273 at the village in the valley. He remembered the vampire cottage from 2 weeks ago having the number 57, so this place would be a great distance away. Besides for the mystery of who the old man was and the forbidden knowledge that he possessed, Victor, throughout his travel, wanted to know more about the night-flying woman, a witch with green eyes and black velvet clothing that claimed to be from the same land as him. He knew witches could not entirely be trusted, even the ones who used their magic to do good. There was just something about them that rubbed the werewolf the wrong way. Then he thought about it carefully. What if this wasn't about him at all? What if the witch and this old man wanted the ancient stone tablet that Victor currently possesses? Zumra, the village witch, came from the land of Redwater, a place where folk of the supernatural kind coexisted in a mutualistic environment, sharing skills, knowledge, and resources. But that mutualism never existed when she was a child. Zumra was an orphan taken care of by Mrs. Hannah, an elderly retired nurse that was labeled a heretic, someone who challenged established norms, beliefs, and traditions for harboring a witch child. However, Zumra was no ordinary witch. Her mother was a pure witch, meaning born as one, whereas her father was a sorcerer. She didn't remember much about her parents' death as she was just a baby, but she did know that demons were responsible. When she was born, both her parents' skills had passed down to her, which made surviving in the world a bit easier, for Zumra was mute. She had the powers of telepathy and telekinesis, while obtaining the knowledge and the practice of incantations that could be cast without spoken word, rather through hand gestures. The power or skill level of witches was much different than werewolves or vampires. While werewolves had 3 categories, natural born, cursed, and special class, and vampires had 2 categories, lesser and higher, witches had a letter tier system. Zumra would fall under the A tier category of witchcraft, just 1 level below the crones at S tier, similar to Myra, the most well-known witch of Redwater. Zumra entered this current unknown land the same time Victor did. That night, back at home, when a blue beam shot up into the sky and the ground split in half, Zumra was near the blast before getting suctioned into the beam. The witch's memories of that incident had become rather blurred, but she did remember hearing voices in the beam, voices of other people that met the same fate as her. Moments after, she woke up in the forest, unable to return home. To her surprise, Zumra noticed this land, much like hers when she was a child, still held witch hunts and the burning of witches at the stake in high regard. For more than 2 weeks, she was hunted by the Inquisition, a group of merciless hunters that accused anyone with characteristics, behaviors, or even speech that deviated from what they considered normal, till she entered the cottage 273 at the village in the valley. There, an old man provided her with shelter, and ever since, she's been working in his remedy and spice shop, brewing potions for the sickly while trying to find answers on how to return home, just like Victor. She never liked using her powers with the exception of dire situations. The only person she spoke to telepathically was the blind man providing her with shelter. The rest of the folk she served in the spice and remedy store were communicated through written word, since most folk in this land never knew sign language. However, at night in her spare time, it just so happened that from deciphering ancient manuscripts,
One of the answers found leading back to her homeland was grey fur, whereas on Victor's side the stone tablet revealed an ingredient of cypress root, something coincidentally Zumra needed in the remedy store. Throughout her time in this land, Zumra had a dream of Victor. Of course, she never knew him personally, but a towering humanoid-like werewolf with grey fur and glowing blue eyes had occupied her thoughts and visions. She never paid attention to it on the first night, but since then Victor was all she could dream of. The witch felt an intense connection to a monster that she never knew. It reached a point where dream world and reality became blurred and frustrating, so the witch set out to find a grey werewolf with blue eyes, said to be in this land through her visions. She didn't expect 120 hunters to chase her down and mercilessly attack her. But these hunters were smart and more than capable of defending themselves against the witch. They never attacked her head-on, rather lured her in from a smaller, helpless group, pretending to be injured and seeking help for their wounds. Zumra, being the kind witch she was, chose to help those men in need, knowing that judging folk by hunting clothing was the same judgment that she received her entire life. However, sometimes, just sometimes, kindness backfires into one's very own demise. Meanwhile, Victor was approaching the brick cottage in the valley. He heard commotion from a mile away and caught the scent of oil on wood. When he got closer using a tall tree as cover, he saw hunters vandalizing the brick cottage while a scared old man was on the ground outside the door. He looked terrified, trembling, and his voice begged for help. There was a gash on the side of his forehead caused by the hunter's weapons. Next to him were his glasses and a cane. Victor saw the old man's eyes were a murky grayish color. With his trembling, fragile hand, he pulled the hunter's clothing, begging them to stop and spare him, the witch, and his spice and remedy store. But they trampled his head with their filthy boots. These hunters were ruthless. They were vile and vicious with no remorse or conscience. They shattered the windows of the brick cottage, broke the vials and containers with medicine for the village, toppled over the wooden tables, ripped the carpets apart. They were looking for something, perhaps belonging to the witch. However, they were interrupted when they heard a deep growl. Before they could even think about turning around inside the cottage, Victor the werewolf grabbed one of the hunters through the shattered window and pulled him outside through the shards of glass. The werewolf didn't waste time beating him up, just a vicious claw across the hunter's face. By then, the rest of the 5 hunters exited the cottage, spears wielded with their right hand while daggers in their left. They charged at the werewolf. Victor dismantled the group quickly. From bites to winging punches and claw swipes, the hunters were falling like flies. The werewolf grabbed the leg of the last hunter and swung him against the tree like his body was a baseball bat. But unlike a baseball bat which would snap or splinter, every bone in the hunter's body broke as he wrapped around the tree like he was part of the bark all along. Victor rushed to the old blind man on the ground, gently picking him up and checking his wounds. He said, "Don't be afraid, sir. I am here too." But his words were interrupted. The blind man said, "Oh, thank goodness it's you," and he felt Victor's thick fur on his forearms. "Please hurry," the old man said. "They took Zumra." Victor carried the man inside the cottage and placed him on a chair. He noticed there was a piece of a hooded garment hung neatly on one of the cabinets, a cowl made from thick black velvet. The werewolf picked it up and brought it to his nose, taking a snuff. For a brief moment, Victor had forgotten what he was doing inside the cottage. This cowl smelled of sugared red berries and rose meringue, a scent that invoked a sense of calm, peacefulness, and love. Quickly, he shook his head, snapping him out of this hypnosis that he felt, then took a few more snuffs of air to balance the smell. The cowl belonged to Zumra, and Victor had now captured a scent to follow. He checked on the blind man one more time, then made haste following the scent and pointing his snout in the air each time. When he heard heavy boots thumping against the ground, the branches of the trees almost screaming and roaring in the forest, as well as the scent being at an all-time high, he knew he was closer. The werewolf moved like the wind, running as swiftly as he could while alternating from time to time between leaping from tree to tree. However, was the witch still even alive? Zumra opened her eyes slowly with blurry vision. Her eyelids felt heavy and her head ached with pain. She also had an awful taste in her mouth, a sour, oily taste that made her cough a few times. But when she tried to move, she couldn't. She felt the rope tied around her waist and arms, pinning her against a wooden pole. In front of her were at least 50 hunters, with fire torches in one hand and a weapon, either a sword or a spear, in the other. Her grogginess left her body as she frantically moved about, trying to break free. Her movement slowed with the sudden realization of seeing a trail of paraffin soaked at the bottom of the wooden pole, leading to the group of hunters. This wasn't a trial, it was a sacrifice. The hunters spoke among themselves, but there was another man part of the gathering. He wasn't a hunter, at least not from the robes he wore. He was bald, old, and his eyes were black. Zumra encountered demons before, but he just didn't seem like one. The witch found strength in her hands and, while restrained with limited movement, began moving her fingers around to cast a spell. With her eyes glowing green, visible through the thick fog in the forest that night, Zumra expected the ground to crack in half and devour the hunters and the strange man into its unforgiving abyss. But her magic didn't work. The hunters laughed and cursed at her even more. One of them held a round flask wrapped in leather and poured out some of the oil on the ground while pointing at his tongue. Zumra's eyes widened with fear. That was the taste in her mouth. The hunters had nullified her powers with whatever oil was filled in that flask. How would mere hunters know about potion brewing to cancel a witch's ability? With so much going on in front of her, she only realized afterwards there were 3 more witches tied to their respective wooden poles. However, they weren't alive. Their bodies were burning, but they never screamed or yelled in pain. They had a huge hole in their chest, and Zumra noticed their hearts were missing. What kind of witch hunt was this, she thought? This resembled ritual sacrifice, not a witch trial. Then the strange man with the darkened, murky eyes began chanting something as he swayed side to side. His movements resembled behavior of a drunk man, though it didn't seem like he was in control of his body anymore. Like he was a puppet and the strings were guiding his actions. A hunter walked towards Zumra, looking at her perversely, and licked the sharp side of his knife. As he was about to remove the heart from the witch, they heard a deep roar which frightened them instantly. The hunters backed away, moving behind Zumra, and the strange man with the blackened eyes had broken out of the trance. He was fearful and panicky, and Zumra realized it was possession. But from what? Or by who? Victor slowly emerged from the foliage. He unsheathed his claws and moved his fingers slowly, like a gunslinger getting ready to draw his revolver. He walked to the witch as her green eyes widened with fear. It was one thing dreaming of Victor, but seeing the monster in the flesh so close to her was terrifying. The werewolf moved in front of her, drawing a line with his foot on the forest ground. A line that indirectly said, if anyone crosses it, they will die. However, there was no time to untie Zumra. Victor didn't expect the hunters to charge forward so quickly. The man behind them reverted to his possessed state. His eyes turned black and he ran as if his kneecaps were shattered. But why, the werewolf thought? Why would ordinary hunters who were smaller than him, weaker than him, and have no way of knowing on how to kill him, charge forward? Victor took a low stance, bending the knees and slouching forward. His long sharp teeth pushed out his mouth and his claws were at his side, ready to slice them apart. However, as the hunters charged forward, they were dropping like flies. Arrows found their mark dead center of their foreheads and not a centimeter off on either side. Robin Hood was in a nearby tree with his hooded attire, firing arrows as easy and naturally as breathing. Those who weren't hit by the arrows reached Victor with false bravado. They charged forward towards their demise, getting torn apart, ripped to shreds, and limbs being bitten off. Robin Hood then jumped down from the tree and rolled on the ground to distribute the impact on his legs. He untied Zumra and took her to a nearby tree to sit down for a spell. The witch was exhausted, and whatever poison or potion they gave to her hindered her powers for a longer time than she expected them to. When the hunters were slain, Victor moved onto the strange man with murky black eyes. To the werewolf's surprise, when the man attacked Victor with an opened palm like a forceful push, it sent the werewolf flying through the forest, breaking trees along the way. Robin Hood fired arrows one after the other, but the possessed man let them strike him. The trance he was in didn't allow him to feel pain. Within the blink of an eye, he dashed forward, moving so fast it seemed like teleportation, and struck Robin Hood with a backhand. The outlaw archer dodged before taking on the full impact, but even still, his nose poured with blood and he received a concussion. Zumra crawled towards him, checking if he was okay, when Victor leapt out of the shadows, tackling the man to the ground. The werewolf's eyes were no longer blue. They were not innocent and kind anymore. His eyes were glowing red, and both Robin Hood and Zumra had never seen anything as frightening before. Victor and the possessed man tussled for a while, with the werewolf performing a push kick, dropping him to the ground and then standing over his chest. Almost instantly, the man broke out of the trance and screamed in pain, feeling every wound he received thus far. Before Victor or Zumra could ask the man what they were doing in the forest, who sent them, what ritual or sacrifice of witches were taking place, the man sat up involuntarily and his head turned 180 degrees, snapping his neck by an invisible force. The werewolf walked to Zumra, who was still very much dazed. Her wounds were looking worse than before, and Robin Hood, though on his feet, was wobbling. Victor carried Robin Hood on his back while carrying Zumra in front, with his arms under her back and legs, taking them to safety. With Robin Hood receiving the treatment he needed in his village, Victor took the witch to the hunter's cabin. The people were forgiving regarding him since he helped the village before, but he wasn't sure on how they would react to a witch. After 2 hours, Zumra awoke from her sleep on the hunter's bed. She saw her wounds had been tended to, stitched and bandaged with immaculate care and precision. When she stood up too quickly, she bent forward and winced in pain. Zumra then slowly climbed up the ladder in the cabin leading to a trapdoor above. She exited the cabin to find Victor nearby, sitting around a small campfire. He had an old pot over the fire and a stew cooking over a low heat. Victor sat on a tree log while another vacant one was kept opposite him. The witch brushed her hair behind her ear with her fingers, smiled just a little and awkwardly waved at Victor, then sat on the vacant tree log. The werewolf gave a nod of his head, greeting her also quite awkwardly. He was shy. There was silence for a while until Victor served hot stew to Zumra in an old wooden bowl and said, "Eat. You'll feel better." For some reason, the werewolf felt like he knew this woman his entire life. Zumra, using sign language, said thank you. Victor realized instantly Zumra was mute but not deaf. When he signed back to her saying, "You're welcome," she had an ecstatic smile on her face. Not many people at the time knew sign language.
But since Victor was a surgeon before, he was required to learn multiple languages including sign language to communicate with his patients. Despite the strong aroma from the stew being carried in the night breeze, Zumra's perfume of sugared red berries and rose meringue was still strong enough for Victor to smell. Whenever he smelled her perfume, he felt like he was floating in the sky, with the clouds like blankets comforting him. They spoke amongst themselves about the night of the blue beam reaching the sky. Zumra found out Victor had caused that, though not intentionally. This was a result from completing the werewolf trials as a special class werewolf. She also told him how she heard other voices in the portal that brought them to this land. Maybe there were others for them to find. Victor also brought up the strange man with murky black eyes under possession. Zumra mentioned she'd never seen anything like it before, at least not that level of possession or manipulation. From what began as simple chatter through sign language, had ended up being a long conversation in the starry night of werewolf and witch forming a bond that none of them expected to. From smiles and giggles to cute nose scrunches from Zumra and fur scratches from Victor, the werewolf felt something that he thought he would never feel again. After a while, when Zumra found the strength to stand on her own without wincing in pain, she bid Victor farewell after he gave her the cypress root she needed. As she walked away, Victor called out to her and said, "Zumra, your cowl." She looked over her shoulder and this time had communicated with him through telepathy, telling him to keep it, just in case she got lost again before they met the next time. Then he could always find her. Thus, the break of dawn arrived as Zumra returned to the spice and remedy shop, tending to the old blind man giving her shelter, while Victor spent the morning clearing up the campsite. However, what happened next sent chills down his spine. An eerie voice came through as the forest turned silent. It seemed the insects, the wind, the birds, and the travelers had disappeared for a brief moment.
Werewolf.
The werewolf looked around him, his battle stance activated on a dime. The fur on his spine rose, his claws sharp and long at the ready. He grunted and growled, showing his teeth as his eyes scanned the environment.
You cannot see me, but I have seen you. You possessed the man at the witch trial. That I did. Who? What are you? Another worthless demon? Do not insult me by putting me next to an angel or a demon. I do not serve anyone. What do you want from me? You interfered with the ritual, with my food. You prolonged my return. You witnessed a glimpse of my power through that human. What do you think will happen when my soul is fed to its fullest? What are you? I am the forest itself, child. And I will return. I will have that witch's heart sooner or later. You touch her, and I will sever however many limbs you have. I will tear you apart and shred you to pieces to cook in my stew. Do you understand me? Tough talk for a pathetic, filthy werewolf. You do not hold a candle to me, you mindless beast. Be gone, I say. Suddenly, the forest returned to its normal state, with the environmental ambience stinging the werewolf's ears. Who or what was this new devilry? Why did Victor feel scared? Furthermore, why was this thing feeding on the hearts belonging to witches? What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? One is the predator of the night, a warrior forged from a curse living in the shadows. The other is the undisputed king of the woods, with a fever of rage waiting to erupt. This battle isn't just a special class werewolf against a monstrous bear. It's shadow versus mountain, moon versus earth. But do stay till the end, for the bear is much more than just a beast hunting Victor tonight. And for the first time in a long time, the werewolf of the prophecy may have just met his match. Usually when night falls, Victor, the special class werewolf, would exit the hunter's cabin he's residing in, then enter the vast forest and keep the land safe with the help of his friend Timothy. But a werewolf needn't find shelter in a cozy cabin, at least not for an ordinary beast. However, Victor's werewolf curse was permanent. The monster and the human became one a long time ago. Though, that didn't mean the full moon never impacted his life. If anything, Victor was far stronger in the moonlight. When he climbed up the ladder and lifted the trapdoor open, the werewolf expected to smell the rain-soaked earth, hear the wind whistling through the trees, and the anticipation of the nearby village bell to ring 3 times. Instead, before barely making it all the way out, he felt sharp claws dig into his furry back. Then, what happened next had frightened Victor more so than the pain he felt. He had been dragged on the forest ground before being lifted in the air like he weighed less than a feather, and thrown a great distance away with the trunk of a tree breaking his fall. Not many creatures were able to handle Victor that way, but tonight, he wasn't facing an ordinary monster. He grunted in pain, then looked up at the towering brown bear in front of him, but it looked different. Its eyes were red like a possessed devilry. Its body vibrated and jolted almost from how much of rage the beast was feeling. But the most bizarre part was the bear had worn armor. Warrior armor. The agitation phase had been skipped entirely. There was no warning, no jaw popping or teeth clanking, no sudden explosive bursts of air. The bear had even neglected the chuff from the predatory phase, a rhythmic heavy huff, huff, huff sound. The sound like a steam engine starting up, pumping oxygen into its massive muscles. No. This bear had gone straight for the attack or the collision phase. Only now did it let out an ominous bellow, a true deep roar, less than a snarl and more of a scream from the lungs. It stood a head taller than Victor, wearing a pelt that seemed fused to its own muscle. The bear didn't just run, it charged forward like a rageful landslide. The werewolf was barely to his feet and had no choice but to meet the impact head-on. Victor didn't try to stop the bear, he tried to survive its onslaught. The collision sounded like a tree snapping from a lightning strike. Victor's claws raked across the bear's chest, cutting deep through the armor, but the beast did not flinch. The immovable object simply absorbed the pain and swung a heavy paw-like fist that sent Victor across the forest, skidding on the ground. There goes the werewolf's shoulder, a deep gash across the deltoid, a nasty wound that wouldn't last long. The werewolf's special class nature would heal the body quickly. Victor realized he cannot win a contest of strength. For the first time in a long time, he was overpowered. He pivoted into his werewolf instinct, slowed his breathing and looked at the weak points of the beast in front of him. As the bear lunged forward, Victor became the shadow of the moon. He leaped as quickly as a lightning flash. A bite headed straight for the throat, but the bear protected it, giving up its shoulder instead. Victor crawled around the bear's body, taking its back and holding the beast into a rear naked choke. He used all the might his forearms could muster, focusing on the squeeze, not the press. The bear, now angrier than before, slammed its own back against an ancient oak tree in the forest, crushing Victor. The wood splintered and the werewolf groaned in pain. He fell to the ground like a poster, peeling off the wall. This was the perfect moment to seal the bear's victory, or so it seemed.
It charged forward, its large powerhouse body almost shaking the forest ground. But this attack was not led by its claws, rather by its canine teeth. However, this was Victor's ruse. Playing possum was the only thing he could think of in that moment. Moments before the bear could bite him, the werewolf rolled to the side, slashing the bear's right knee. A masterful tactical maneuver by the werewolf, though it didn't buy him the time he thought it would. The bear turned, now with eyes becoming white in a trance-like state. It tore up the very earth with its hands, hurling rocks and stones, forcing Victor to stay in a constant, exhausted state. However, Victor saw an opening. The bear's movements were wide, wild, driven by a fever of rage. It didn't seem to feel pain. There had to be a source for that kind of power, for that level of invincibility. As the bear raised both arms for a crushing overhead slam, Victor didn't retreat. He lunged inward like a wrestler under the guard. He drove his claws low into the soft hinge of the bear's stomach, clawing and grabbing onto whatever he could, using the creature's own massive weight against it. Still, the force of the bear was enough for both monsters to roll on the ground from the impact, tumbling on top of each other until they separated. The forest was silent before Victor groaned in pain as he got up to his feet. In his hand was the pelt worn by the bear, a pelt of its own fur. With Victor's glowing blue eyes in the windy night, he caught a glimpse of someone limping away, though with haste, using the night to disguise his whereabouts. The werewolf looked at the bear pelt in his fist once more, then back at the stranger who had entirely vanished into the night. Victor growled in confusion while clenching the pelt. Who was he? Was that man really able to shapeshift into a monstrous bear? And was this bear pelt the ingredient for such a rageful transformation? One thing was certain, the fight wasn't over. This was just round one. Victor wondered if the entity that spoke to him last night was possessing the bear. The werewolf witnessed a fraction of the entity's power at the witch trial before, but that man had black murky eyes, not red or white. Still, Victor had to be sure. With the bear pelt in his possession, he had a scent to go on, a smell of wet fur, urine, and iron char. There were also markings on the pelt, engravings burned into the fur of a language he never knew. Victor had now made friends with a witch at Cottage 273, as well as his most trusted ally Timothy, but this hunt needed a solo quest. This bear creature was the strongest being the werewolf faced since the trials. He could not and would not put his friends in danger. The rain had started, though not as heavy or ominous. A gentle breeze accompanied by the drizzle as the werewolf's nose guided him on this hunt. The scent led Victor to a wooden house, very simply built and recently done, he presumed. It was built such a way that the trees protected it. There was a boy pacing up and down in front of the house. This kid was no more than 10 years of age, wearing warrior clothing and holding a short sword in his hand. There were fire torches surrounding the house, and Victor saw the same strange engravings on the pelt were on the door. Then the boy saw the werewolf and his body tensed. Victor knew that look all too well. Fight or flight. The boy chose the former. With his tiny feet, he planted himself firmly on the ground, while his trembling hands pointed the sword at the werewolf. Victor raised his arms above his head, surrendering. He hid his gnarly fangs and sharp claws to not frighten the boy.
Please, do not be afraid of me. I will not hurt you. I am merely looking for someone.
Victor didn't know what to expect, but the boy not fleeing for his life was certainly not one of them. The boy trembled with fear and asked,
"So that pelt in your hand, did you kill the one that it belongs to?"
He tried to grunt and roar to scare Victor away, hiding the astonishment of hearing a werewolf talk.
No, I did not. May I approach?
The boy thought about it for a while and said,
You may. Leave the pelts on the branch though, and do not try anything funny, okay? I'm watching you carefully.
It was a bittersweet moment for the werewolf. On one hand, he wanted to show a smile of admiration for the boy's courage and bravery, whereas on the other hand, he was heart-sore witnessing a child, especially at that age, to have lived a life of survival and hardship. Victor walked closer, still in a submissive posture. His blue eyes had a glow to them as he dropped down to one knee. With his arms still raised, he said,
I did not kill him, though you should not be wandering around here. He's very scary and very dangerous.
The boy dropped his guard, lowering his sword with a sense of offense.
Why would I be afraid of Haldor?
You know him?
Of course I do. He's my bigger brother.
Victor dropped his arms, pondering, but his thoughts were disturbed when he heard footsteps behind him. The limping stranger from earlier snatched the pelt off the branch. He donned it around his waist and Victor saw the transformation in real time. It wasn't painful, excruciating, or messy like a werewolf transformation. This was spectral, almost fantastical. The very ground he stood on erupted in flames, and through the smoke emerged the bear. The same warrior, armor, brown fur, sharp teeth and red eyes. The bear charged at Victor before the werewolf could say wait. The boy dove out the way, also trying to speak to Haldor, but the rage-like trance had consumed him. The werewolf leaped out the way and growled, thinking to himself, crap, here we go again. He yelled at the bear, I am not your enemy, though it served no purpose. Round 2 of the battle commenced. Bites, claw swipes, pushes and throws. Victor knew if he held back he would die. Then Haldor grabbed Victor in a bear hug, squeezing the life out of the werewolf. With both titans facing each other, Victor did not only have to worry about the bear's enormous hands pressing down and squeezing his back, but also the sharp teeth gnawing at his face. The werewolf's patience and tolerance were wearing thin. Like a veil over his pupils, Victor's eyes changed from blue to red. His strength from his special class nature had gifted him with power, also channeled by rage. With an opened palm, he hit and pushed against the chin of the bear, a powerful attack that loosened the bear hug. Victor then used both his legs and kicked the bear's chest, pushing himself away from the danger. The bear, though still standing, skidded across the forest ground. He roared at Victor, then grabbed a nearby rock, throwing it in the werewolf's direction. Victor rolled out the way, his claws dragged on the ground, helping him to his feet. But then, Victor's attention diverted to the boy. He moved like a shadow, running towards the child. Haldor, the monstrous bear, thought the werewolf was going to devour his little brother, but that was far from the truth. The rock the bear threw just a few seconds ago had snapped a tree at the bottom of the trunk. The broken remainder was now falling over directly where the boy stood. The werewolf dove and stood behind the boy, protecting him and stopping the fallen tree with his large, outstretched but slightly bent forearm. Just as the bear was going to strike Victor down, he immediately stopped, witnessing what happened. He removed the pelts from his waist, and the bear changed back into the man with long dark hair and bushy beard. The boy ran to his bigger brother, holding him tightly and crying. Victor pushed the fallen tree resting on his forearm to the side. Then he looked at Haldor and said,
What is your deal? What quarrel do you have with me?
Haldor had a protective stance over his little brother. The warrior's eyes were 2 balls of flames as he ground his teeth.
You and your fellow Inquisition hunters killed my family. Killed your... I do not even know who you are. Secondly, do I look like a hunter to you? Then why do you reside in an underground hunter's cabin? I killed that hunter when I got here. He was an evil man going by the name Thesis. He tortured innocent people, labeling them as monsters to justify his actions. I sought shelter in his cabin for obvious reasons. No land is familiar with a werewolf roaming around in plain sight.
Wait, you said when you got here. Where do you come from? Asked Haldor.
I came from the land of Redwater. When I completed the werewolf trials, a blue beam
shot up into the sky and teleported you here.
How do you know that?
Haldor brushed his fingers through his little brother's hair and held him close. Because we are also from the Redwater Forest. We were near the blast that night and woke up in this unknown land.
Victor frowned. Zumra, the witch from last night, was indeed correct in her theory. She heard other voices in the blue beam that night. The werewolf sighed.
What are you exactly?
Folks may have many names for us, or perhaps none at all. We hail from a clan of warriors, known as the Berserkers.
The storm had intensified. A heavy downpour, severe lightning, vicious thundercracks and gale-force winds had consumed the forest that night. Haldor invited Victor inside the slapdash wooden house. The werewolf pulled a chair and sat at the table. There were candles burning at different locations in the house, providing a warm yet subtle light. Jarl, the 10-year-old boy Haldor's little brother, was busy in the kitchen.
Some tea?
Asked Haldor.
Yes, please. That would be lovely.
Victor Humbridge wondered how long it's been since he had tea. However, there were no tea bags or strainers. Jarl began brewing the tea leaves in a pot. One's teeth would have to serve as filters to prevent sediment or silt from being swallowed. Once the tea was made, Haldor embraced his brother once more and tucked him into a makeshift bed. They never had much indeed, but Haldor had made Jarl's lodgings as comfortable as possible. He wrapped him up in a warm blanket and kissed his forehead, telling him to get some sleep. Then Haldor joined Victor at the table.
You're quite strong for a werewolf, you know. Not many sent me skidding across the ground, let alone live to tell the tale. Those markings burn into your forearm, the speech retention, upright posture, glowing blue eyes. You're the special class werewolf, are you not?
One of them.
Interesting. I've heard of Ragnar Leifson, the great warrior knight turned werewolf, though I've never heard of you. From one warrior to another, though, why did you hold back?
What kind of man would I be if I had slain you in front of your brother? You are strong, very strong, though our battle needn't my full power.
Victor Humbridge, in his werewolf form, displayed traits of a rather kind but sorrowful being. Yes, he was a monster, but his smile was warm, though his eyes had immense pain behind them. The werewolf was quiet, introverted in a way, and only spoke when he needed to. He also had a sense of righteousness to him that was comforting, not arrogant. This monster was more human than people were. However, when a flash of lightning provided light in the dark wooden house, Haldor looked at Victor properly after that statement. He realized just how frightening Victor really was, and if the special class werewolf wanted to end him, he might be very well capable of doing so. There was an awkward silence that lingered for too long, until Haldor spoke.
Well, my condition isn't like yours. We berserkers haven't been cursed. The spirit of the bear has been passed down to us from our forefathers.
When we fought the first time, I removed the pelt and you changed into a human again. So, you're a shapeshifter?
Not exactly. There were many types of berserkers. My father, for example, never changed into a bear. Instead, the spirit of the bear lived inside him. I was petrified when I saw it take over. He was preparing for battle and began shivering. The fever came first, then the swelling and redness of the face. His body was so hot that we were scared his skin would burst into flames. He would chew pieces of his iron shield in urgency, engaging in battle. To us, he wasn't a bear, but to his enemies in the battlefield, that's what they saw. He never felt pain. The berserker trance doesn't allow it. No blade or fire ever hindered him.
But you were limping away after we fought.
Yes,
When the trance wears off, we feel everything. My father used to sleep for days just to recover from the physical and mental drain from the berserker rage. I've obtained many wounds in my life, werewolf. Once there was an evil creature that slit my throat, and the bear spirit healed it. My grandfather was special though. Physically, he never fought on the battlefield or needed a pelt. He would be asleep, and his spirit merged with the bear would appear in its spectral form on the battlefield.
Why the bear pelt then?
The bear is the undisputed king of the forest. He is the master of the hunt, something we warriors were born to do. Wearing an animal pelt is the embodiment of said animal. We believe it to grant us the ability to mimic traits from it, the power, the instinct, survival and rage.
So the pelt helps you transform into a bear?
Yes and no. In my case, my transformation resulted from my carelessness. Jan was much younger at the time. We went hunting and I ate a mushroom, fly agaric, which is incredibly dangerous to humans. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, intense confusion, hallucinations, dizziness and muscle spasms. However, with the bear pelt on, the mushroom side effect responded differently to my body. That was only part of it though. My mother, who was a witch, cast her charms onto the bear pelt. Those markings allow me to channel the bear spirit into a physical manifestation. When we ended up in this place, we had nothing. Jan and I went hunting, and when we returned, my mother, father, cousins, they were all slain by hunters. They removed her heart from her chest.
I'm so sorry.
No need to be. My heart doesn't have the capacity for grief or sorrow, but there is plenty room for revenge. I've been tracking down hunters and piling their bodies behind the house. I found out they're part of a cult known as the Inquisition. It seems to be a
Ritualistic killings.
How do you know that?
Long story short, I rescued a witch from a witch trial. But these weren't even trials, they were sacrifices. They were removing hearts from witches and then burning them at the stake. The hearts were obviously offerings to an entity of some sort in the forest. There were peculiar wooden sticks propped up into a figure. Strange markings on them as well. At the witch trial, whatever this thing was, had possessed a man orchestrating the ritual. He was strong, far stronger than I expected him to be. This entity spoke to me in the early hours of the morning. Said it can see me, but I can't see it. It said that it will have the heart of the witch that I've saved, and that it isn't at its full form, though I know not what it is. I've fought demons before, but this isn't one of them. It's obviously targeting witches for some reason. I set out tonight to find answers and unravel the mystery, but I was interrupted by you wanting to take my head off. Haldor walked away from the table, retrieved something from his room, and placed it on the table. Though, he never touched it with his fingers, rather used 2 wooden sticks to handle it. The warrior perspired while doing so, like he was handling dynamite. It was a belt made of braided birch bark mixed with human hair, tangled with vines. As Victor reached for the belt, Haldor said, "Don't touch it!" And the werewolf retracted his hand immediately. What on earth is this?
I found it when I was hunting. I had my suspicions when I came across it in the forest. But when Jarl found a single left leather boot outside our house, then it made sense.
I do not follow. You know what the entity is?
Yeah, it's a leshy.
Whether the Leshy had been a fallen angel or a soul rejected by both heaven and hell, he's ultimately a genius Loki, a spirit of the forest that actually is the forest, not merely one that inhabits it. The forest serves as an extension to his body and will. The Leshy is a shape-shifting spirit, though his true form remains a mystery. He could appear as a wolf, a bear, a tree, anything and everything. But his common appearance became familiar with folk of the past. Often the Leshy would appear as a tall peasant man,
sometimes extraordinarily so that he could be taller than a tree, and sometimes so tiny that he could hide behind a blade of grass. In his humanoid disguise, his skin is pale, his eyes are green, and his hair looks like moss or needles from a pine tree. His shoes were worn on the wrong feet, his coat was buttoned right to left, the reverse side of normal, and his hair was parted on the wrong side, whichever was deemed to be the correct side at the time. This consistency for the inversion wasn't random. The Leshy was the mirror world to the human civilization. However, when the Leshy began controlling the forest many centuries ago, he wasn't good nor evil, though deeply territorial. The forest had been his domain, and as with any domain, there were rules. When folk needlessly cut down trees, hunted excessively or without permission, and travelers displaying loud, boastful behavior, they became his targets. His favorite act was leading travelers astray. He delighted in causing people to walk in circles for hours, days, or even longer. Peasants believed he literally scrambled your sense of direction by changing the space and time of the forest itself, while using mimicry to further confuse them. He caused madness, either temporarily or permanently. However, he was also capable of genuine friendship and fair exchange. Hunters and shepherds in particular would make deals with him, offering gifts, either bread, salt, sometimes clothing, and asking for safe passage or good hunting. He honored those agreements which separated him from purely malevolent spirits. Since the Leshy ruled all animals of the forest, he was essentially the master of the hunt, which put him in an interesting relationship with human hunters who needed his tactic permission to succeed. So at this point, the Leshy doesn't sound bad at all. He never went against his word, he held up his ends of the bargains, and he became known as a harmful trickster. But that playfulness would soon change. He began manipulating the weather, causing further damage to villages and towns for the sake of it. An unexpected storm, a flood, thick fog smothering the land. If you wondered why the forest has displayed such strange behavior in the previous 4 episodes, now you know why. The Leshy's trickery resorted to loss of livestock, resources, and shelter. But it became much worse. Folk reported their loved ones going missing when they entered the forest. They searched high and low for them, but there were no signs of those people, like they never existed at all. He would steal them, particularly children and young women, hiding them in his realm beneath tree roots or in hollow trunks. Of course, the village folk never knew that, though when a coven of witches arrived to the land, they unraveled the mystery. When it came to witches, they were always seen in a negative notion. Curses, dark magic, frightening rituals, possessions, and sorcery, those were and will always be linked to them. However, much like people, not all witches had malice in their hearts. This coven of witches in particular were chased out of their homeland and found shelter in the forest. Trying to survive in a world of constantly being hunted and burned at the stake, they never held animosity towards human folk. They would brew their potions, create ointments, and cast their spells for ailments only. Then they would charge their craft at a reasonable price, just enough for food and shelter. As time passed, keeping them away from hunters, villages and towns sheltered these witches, providing them with food and work in exchange for their unique concoctions. But the Leshy never liked that. Being a temperamental spirit, much of his actions were dependent on his mood like a petulant teenager. He felt jealous that somehow his tricks were not amusing folk anymore. They were not praising him, they stopped making deals with him, and he became angrier than he ever was. When the coven found out he'd been abducting people from the forest, the witches used a darker form of magic to get rid of the Leshy. There was a great supernatural battle that took place during that event, almost destroying half of the forest. Many witches died that night, but the remaining 5 fought till the very end, casting a sealing spell to trap the Leshy inside a tree. He could still talk and have some power left, though not enough to cause any trouble. They cursed him, solidifying the spell that if a witch had sealed him, then only a witch's life source would be able to release him. Over time, those 5 witches had passed on from old age. They thought their spell would hold for the rest of eternity, but they were wrong. Since hunters had built a relationship with the Leshy, the spirit commanded them to hunt down witches rather than animals. This group of hunters, along with religious folk who had disdain for witchcraft, have been known as the Inquisition. Controlled by the Leshy, they would capture any witch that entered the land, tie them to the stake, remove their heart, and burn them. Then they would perform a ritual using the heart, the witch's life source, sacrificing it to the Leshy spirit inside the tree. Zumra would be the only remaining witch left in this land, but she wasn't just an ordinary witch. She was the last piece of the puzzle, the final ingredient in the Leshy ritual. Zumra's heart would serve as the 5th and final life source given to the Leshy, as 4 witches have already been sacrificed, 3 at the witch trial Victor had interrupted, and the other being Haldor's mother. Therefore, the werewolf and the bear serve no purpose to the Leshy. To the spirit, those 2 are mere hindrances in his escape from the seal. Zumra has been the key the moment she ended up in this unknown land. Now, back to the wooden house. The conversation between the werewolf and the berserker had been interrupted. Someone was at the door. Victor took his battle stance and Haldor changed into a bear. The werewolf saw the berserker transformation before, but he still couldn't believe it. How effortlessly and silently Haldor could change into a beast was fascinating. Werewolf and bear never worried about themselves though. Their urgency in being prepared was for Jarl sleeping in his room. Victor walked towards the door as the knocking continued. Slowly, he placed his furry fingers on the wooden latch and opened the door quickly. His sharp claws raised in the air, ready to slice whoever was at the door. However, he retracted his claws immediately. It was Zumra the witch and his beloved friend Timothy. They were drenched from the downpour, which made sense as to why Victor couldn't get the scent of the witch's perfume, sugared red berries and rose meringue. The werewolf looked over his shoulder at Haldor and gave the go-ahead to stand down. Timothy and Zumra entered the wooden house, fascinated that Haldor could change into a bear. Just as the berserker reached for the other 2 wooden chairs, Zumra's eyes glowed green as she flexed her finger joints, as if tightening an invisible large screw, and the chairs lifted by themselves and placed around the table. Victor was really glad Timothy's injuries were healing quite nicely from the previous night. After acquaintances were made, werewolf, witch, bear, and archer spoke about the way forward. The storm had drowned out their conversation, which they thought worked in their favor. Perhaps the heavy rain and thunder would prevent the Leshy from hearing them. Though amidst their words, Victor realized how futile the situation really was. What could a werewolf, a bear, and an archer possibly do against an ancient spirit of the forest? The only one who could do something would be Zumra. But even still, it took an entire coven of witches to trap the Leshy inside the tree. If Zumra's power fails, the Leshy could have a heart. It had been spying on them all this time, but the heroes, at this point, had no idea of the Leshy's true power. An ancient spirit turned evil could not just be defeated overnight. However, Zumra mentioned that she found a way to open a portal back to their homeland, though she wasn't sure if the Leshy would let them leave. Her solution was to offer herself up to the ancient spirits, giving Victor and Haldor a safe passage to return home. The werewolf had been infuriated by this. "Over my dead body," were his exact words. His anger and emotion on this matter clearly displayed feelings for the green-eyed witch, something that everyone at the table noticed except Victor. Nevertheless, his reasoning was valid. Victor told them that plan would actually backfire. It would be a false notion to assume the Leshy would stop once he'd been free. He would then move his attention to the human folk, the villages and towns that harbored the witches that sealed him. He would hunt down any and every witch that entered the land. He would torture folk who had no magical powers just to send a message that he was in charge, all while being at his full strength.
Then Timothy interrupted. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn. I understand that I have no say in the supernatural matters, but may I suggest something?" Of course, Zumra and Haldor had no idea who Timothy really was. To them, he was just a simpleton. Victor said,
"My friend, if I have ever seen wizardry before my very eyes, it was seeing you with a bow. Your level of archery and tactics rival that of the elves. You have every right to speak at this table."
Timothy gave a warm smile and a nod of the head at the werewolf. Robin Hood could have easily ignored this matter. He could have lived a simple life in a simple village, with none being the wiser. He never needed to help them, and for that, Victor would rather die in this land than leave a malevolent entity to haunt Robin Hood and his people. "Thank you, my friend. I've been thinking about this whole debacle since the witch trial. Zumra here has been kind enough to tell me what a leshy is, and I wondered, why didn't the leshy possess anyone else?" Witch, werewolf, and bear were silent. They leaned forward frowning, trying to come up with an answer, but they couldn't. The leshy has never been known to possess people in the first place. Which got me thinking even more. The Inquisition had been present at the witch trial. Hunters and corrupted officials were there as well, and that's who the leshy possessed. So a pact was formed, a binding of some sort. What if these rituals weren't just sacrifices of a witch's life source, but their own as well? Haldor leaned back in his chair smiling. The bear warrior was impressed. Hence, if we take out the Inquisition, we have nothing to worry about. This entity, for as long as it existed in this land, had only caused strange weather patterns. Only when witches showed up did his actions become more intense. And since the Inquisition have become his vessels, if we take them out, the spirit of the tree would remain trapped in the forest. It was a plan better than any. Victor, Zumra, and Robin Hood would return to the hunter's cabin to strategize a plan of attack. Haldor would accompany, but not at this time of night, especially with Jarl being all alone. However, just before the three of them could open the door to leave, Victor stopped dead in his tracks. With Zumra and Robin Hood behind him, as well as Haldor next to the werewolf, they wondered why Victor was frozen in place. The werewolf, without moving his body, looked out the windows of the wooden house and said,
"When have any of you known such a vicious storm to stop so abruptly?"
Suddenly, the allies were tense. Robin Hood drew an arrow in his bow, keeping it ready. The hood of his brown cloak still dawned. Zumra's eyes glowed green as her fingers began moving awkwardly, ready to cast her magic. Haldor, from berserker to bear, took a low, pouncing stance, while Victor slowly and carefully opened the latch of the wooden door with his furry fingers. There was no one at the door, but what the hero saw surrounding Haldor's house had frightened them so much so they began trembling. Zumra slowly turned to Victor. Her eyes said enough. Haldor the bear stood frozen, and Robin Hood could not even aim his arrow with how heavy and weak his hands felt. Victor said to them,
"Don't move. We have to try and get back into the house."
In front of them was an entire town's worth of Inquisition hunters, standing still like mannequins. They had thin branches stuck in their heads like antlers. Their eyes were black and murky, seemingly larger than normal. Their arms were fallen to their sides as if too heavy to move. Then their heads began moving, a slow, eerie tilt to one side. There had to be at least 500 of them, maybe more that the darkness of the forest could not reveal. Possession of this magnitude was a mere myth. The leshy had stopped playing its games. When the bear took a step forward, every possessed Inquisition hunter took a step forward with him. One step only and no more. They moved in unison, and the sound of their boots rattled the ground. Haldor dared not to move any further. He stood frozen, tilting his head to Victor. His red eyes showed everything he wanted to say. What the hell do we do now?
They could fight their way out. Though if the possessed man with the black murky eyes at the witch trial was strong enough to send Victor flying through the forest, what would 500 or more of them be capable of doing? Jarl was sleeping in his room. If the allies failed, they would snatch the boy away, or worse. So Victor took a gentle step back, not all the way inside the house but close enough to the door, and the Inquisition hunters, with their dangling heads and loose arms, took a step forward instead. The Leshy laughed through them, a laughter that sent chills down the hero's spines. The werewolf closed his eyes in defeat. He didn't move his feet again, but slowly turned his head looking over his shoulder inside the wooden house. He didn't know what to do. He felt like the Leshy had foiled all their plans. The werewolf whispered something to the allies. It was faint, barely coherent, and they nodded their heads in agreement. Victor said afterwards,
"On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Such was the cliffhanger ending in Book 1 of Victor the Werewolf and the Unknown Land of Monsters. If you would like me to continue the series, I will be more than happy to do so. Just let me know in the comments. But for now, I am currently making the second book for the Vampire Cop series, and it's going to be really intense. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed Victor's story. And until the next one, do take care.